Today is the last day of March, March 31st, 2022, and welcome to today's Tech Hour. And I've chosen two topics for us to discuss. The first is prompted by the recent death of Christopher Alexander, who is an architect who had a large influence on software development, particularly through something called design patterns, and a book published by 4 authors who became known as the Gang of 4. And then the other topic is I like tech, complete this in less than 10 words to win a prize. And so I'll go straight into Christopher Alexander. I have to say that I have a bit of an advantage and an interest in this because I've already spoken on a bit of Alexander's work at a Python conference, and the Open University has a pretty good library and I live nearby, so I was able to go to the library and borrow 3 books today to do a bit of reading. I'd seen them all before. So this is, if you like, a first draft of a talk. So Alexander was born in Vienna in Austria in 1936, and with the Anschluss, the takeover by Hitler, his parents moved to England and he became an Englishman. And he studied mathematics at Cambridge and then went into architecture. I think he always wanted to be an architect, and did a PhD at Harvard. A few words about architecture. It's an old profession. It's one of the regulated professions in that you can't be a lawyer or a doctor or a vet or an architect without being a member of the professional society. You can design buildings, but you can't call yourself an architect without being professionally qualified. And there's a whole process. And it's a bit of a closed shop in that the professional body regulates admission to the profession. So if you like, it's a bit like the medieval guilds. So it's a fairly high status profession, and he practiced in the United States. And one way to describe him as he was one of the interesting people that developed in the 60s. So I put him alongside Alan Kay and Stuart Brand, for example. So he had innovative ideas, and he wanted to be. He was rooted in tradition, in particular old tradition, if you like, pre-industrial tradition. But he saw that you couldn't hark back to the past and reproduce it because times had changed. So he was, I'm going outside my realm, if you like, but a bit like Max Planck. Max Planck was a reluctant revolutionary when he introduced Planck's constant, the constant that allowed us to solve the problem of black body radiation. He didn't want to do it. He wanted it to go to 0. But by giving it a specific value, he fitted the experimental output, the experimental results. So that's a bit of background on Alexander and sort of putting him a bit in terms of his context. I'm going to talk a bit about 3 books. The first is Notes on the Synthesis of Form, which was published in 1964, and it has a heavily mathematical appendix. And this book, the appendix, is about how to break something up in such a way that it becomes 2 parts, both of which are complex, but the connection between them is fairly simple. And you're trying to divide something into 2 or more parts in such a way that the complexity lies in the parts and not in the connections. So if you think of Unix as being a collection of parts that fit together well, what it is you decide you need to do something, and then you say, oh, well, we refactor everything so that it all becomes useful parts. So it's breaking things into parts. So we've got that one. then we've got this book from 1975, The Oregon Experiment, which is about the work, practical work, a team of which he was a leading member, did in terms of the architecture or the planning, if you like, of the University of Oregon at a time when massive amounts of money was going into expanding universities and higher education. And what was quite a nice, small provincial university in Eugene, Oregon, was suddenly growing and growing. And oddly enough, for somebody who was a professor at Berkeley, his work was to make it not look like Berkeley, because Berkeley, he said, was a jumble. It didn't work. And going back to the software thing, there's a fantastic cartoon here. I'll show it to you. You will have seen it before. It won't show itself. There we go.
I don't think the small text is legible.
No, it doesn't have, yeah, the small text doesn't have to be legible. It's the standard tree swing cartoon that is used to indicate, it's very popular on software engineers in terms of, well, we make what we're asked to make, but it's not what the customer wanted. So one of the captions is what the user wanted. And one of the captions is as proposed by the project sponsor, and so on. Now, this book was published in 1975. This cartoon, I've done a bit of research, started to become current in the late 60s. And in the 70s, it became quite popular in software engineering. And one of these cartoons appeared in the front cover of a book on software engineering. It was the classic thing of software engineering of, we have successfully produced what the customer doesn't want. And what's amazing is that this appears in a book on architecture, an architecture book. So his version of architecture isn't building monumental skyscrapers or office buildings with plate glass sides because that's where you get as much office space for square footage and so forth. He's interested in buildings that people live in. So then the third book is this thing, which I have to admit has got some wonderful photographs, but I haven't read all the words. And he is very interested in order and life. And he, to some extent in this book, this is the first of a series of 4. This is, if you like, his philosophy. In some sense, what he's saying here is that beauty is not entirely subjective. You can measure it. And if you think that's odd, think about all the other things you're asking machine intelligence, machine learning, artificial intelligence to do. And you can probably, using the statistics implicit in artificial intelligence, machine learning, get some approximation of beauty that works. I'm not saying you would use it as a music critic, but he's not arguing that we want computers to say what's beautiful. What he's wanting to say is that there's some objective correlate. There's some objective meaning to beauty. It's not entirely subjective. And I'm not quite sure why he's doing that, but I think it's quite interesting that he is doing that. And perhaps it may be that for him, beauty is something that fits human nature. And by human nature, he doesn't mean the nature of crippled human beings who wage war, but human beings who've, so to speak, realized human beings. I don't think he says it in those terms, but we may come back to that. So there's a brief introduction to Christopher Alexander, so to speak, the person. And I should, in keeping with Alexander, give you guys an opportunity to make some contributions and ask some questions if you want to. You can ask any question you want, but I don't guarantee to know the answer.
Well, in the web pages about him, there was mention of the quote, agile software development method. This is a phrase that shows up a lot in the trade literature, but to me, it's always seemed like a rather vague concept, and I really don't know what people mean when they talk about it. Do you have a feeling for it? And if so, could you describe what people mean when they talk about agile development?
I'll do something different if that's all right, which is there are 6 principles that appear in the Oregon experiment, and I will tell you what those principles are. And agile software is quite similar to that in that it has principles, and in some sense the principles have Alexander and Agile, I think, are different, but they have elements in common. And Alexander's design patterns and Agile Gang of 4 design patterns are different. And I'll say something about that right now, which is on the back of this book, which is the 3rd of a book of a series of 3. The 2nd volume is a pattern language. And the pattern language, I'm reading from the blurb on the back, so it's sort of Alexander's description of what he means by a pattern language, is an archetypal language which allows any layperson or group of persons to design any part of the environment for themselves. So a typical design pattern might be a window on a stairway letting in light. So and it says it applies equally to the design of houses, public buildings, neighborhoods, streets, gardens, individual window seats, and so forth. So a design pattern is some sort of repeated element that doesn't have to repeat itself exactly. It's not intended to repeat itself exactly, but people sort of know how to use it. So it's a bit like a drop-down menu or a search box. That's a bit like a design pattern. I'll say a bit more about design patterns later if there are no other questions.
I remember reading the Gang of 4 book, or reading part of it, and finding some parts of it really quite thought-provoking, some parts of it sensible, and large chunks of it extremely irritating. Extremely? Irritating. I could only read it so much at a time before the red mist came down. But there were some parts of it that were clearly very well thought through and interesting. And I wonder which of the 4 authors were responsible for the various parts.
Well, they're a gang of 4. They're all swing together or swing separately, hang together or hang separately.
But I think you're right that design patterns and agile are pretty different notions. And sorry, go.
Yeah. In my notes preparing for this meeting, I wrote down 2 design patterns in software. The one is Windows icons, mice, pointers, WIMP, which was the theme, if you like, of the work that Alan Kay did at Xerox PARC. So the interaction is through windows, over tiled windows or overlapping windows, icons that stand for things, a mouse for pointing. So that's it. So you point to the mouse and click it or move objects. So it has the appearance that you're moving a file from one folder to another, for example. And I think it's interesting that Alan Kay was educated, I believe, as a psychologist. And cognitive science, if you like to call it that, it is actually quite important in interface design because the cognitive burden is really important. And when you're in a new building or even an existing building, there's a cognitive burden to using it.
Mm-hmm.
And not only a cognitive burden for a building, but also a sort of satisfaction and pleasure in using the building.
Yes, I think that the thing that was, I thought, very thought-provoking about the Gang of Four book, which you mentioned when you talked about, which has a close analog with the example you mentioned of window in a stairwell, was that all the patterns were much less grand than the overarching paradigm or WIMP interface, but there were fairly dull things, fairly obvious things, like a listener pattern. This, I can't remember them now, but they were quite mundane, quite prosaic, and that seemed to be the startlingly clever thing about them, that they were a way of just writing down elements of a common language that other people could then pick up, go, I see the point, and apply in a possibly completely different language from the one originally thought of. So I think that the thing that was interesting about them was that they weren't a grand scheme, such as a WIMP interface.
Yeah, the sort of commonplace things, if you like.
Yeah, yes, things that are sort of, well, obvious really, but one of the category of things that aren't necessarily terribly obvious until someone has pointed out that they're obvious.
Yeah.
And similarly, going back to Nelson's question, I think that a lot of the Agile stuff is also fairly obvious, really, in retrospect. And it's just that I think I would characterize it as rejecting the idea that you have to plan up front. That the heartbeat of a project should be, does this work? Does this work? Does this work? Does this work? You're nagging users rather than having grand ideas. So I think that if there's a connection between the two, and I'm not sure there is, but if there's a connection, then it's about the prosaic and about the practically working. It's about, and the retrospectively obvious. So it's about modesty, I think, in both cases. That's like I was talking before. It's about modesty, thinking this is what everyone else does. If people understand this, let's do that. I don't know if that makes sense.
I found the Gang of Four book hard to read, and I'm not quite sure why I found it hard to read. I think perhaps because it was reluctant to provide, so to speak, code examples. And I also feel as though they were sort of trying to create a rigid language for patterns.
Yes.
Rather than let the language evolve out of its natural use.
It was a long while ago, but I think that maybe just been the language that I found irritating, and I think that I don't think I think modesty and humility were not how they would characterize the patterns.
I think what I like to do is get back to Alexander, mm-hmm. and then see where we get to. So this first book's really interesting, and it starts with a quotation from Plato. I'll show it to you, and then I'll read it out. First, the taking in of scattered particulars under one idea so that everybody understands what is being talked about. Second, the separation of the idea into parts by dividing it at the joints as nature directs, not breaking any limb in half as a bad carver or sculptor might. So somehow a satisfactory decomposition into parts. And when you say joints, we're talking about human joints, perhaps. I think Plato's talking about human joints. In the 19th and 20th century, there was a realization that the human body had these hormonal systems, which, so to speak, tie the parts together. And the pituitary was discovered to be the master gland. So when we talk about breaking things into parts, if we approach human biology with the point of view of, so to speak, mechanical, physical parts, we'll actually miss a great deal. So this breaking into parts has to be understood intelligently. And Alexander goes on to say, these notes are about the process of design, the process of inventing physical things that display new physical order, organization, form in response to function. Now, how does that differ from writing software? And the answer is software is not a physical object. But otherwise, it's pretty much the same. We're trying to solve a design problem. We have a design problem. We're trying to produce a system that does something. And we're not creating a mechanical calculator in the way that Babbage did. We're writing a software calculator. So it's a sort of literary document, if anything. And he gives us a worked example, an Indian village, and all the various factors that have to interact with each other. And he has about 100 factors. And for each factor, he says, this one relates to these and these and these and these. And then the question is how to break it up into parts. And I find this really fascinating because I'm a pure mathematician. And if we can find the right page. Oh yes, a worked example. I'll just show you a bit of it. There's a whole long list of things. Factors that need to be taken into account in terms of the design of an Indian village. And he has 141 factors. And this is a bit like the Bible with so-and-so begat so-and-so. He's saying these are all the relations between the factors. And at some point, he produces this diagram here, which is a decomposition into parts. So you've got parts A, B, C, and D, and each of those parts has got 3 or 4 parts. And the idea is that you can, so to speak, optimize each part more or less in isolation. And the amount of communication required is limited. And then there's a mathematical appendix, and I'll just show you a bit of it, and it wasn't typeset with TeX. And he's saying that we can feed this information into a computer and it'll give us a decomposition into parts. Roughly speaking, that's what he's saying. I haven't read it that closely. And this was done in 1962 at MIT. And I can't remember what computer system he used, but it was an IBM something or the other. So this was in '64. He was saying we can use computers to decompose things into parts. It's an important problem. These things are very big and complicated, lots of parts. This is the nature of the world. We can't rely on tradition. Here's a different way of doing it. I thought that was really interesting that he was doing that. And I was particularly interested in it because it relates to my mathematical interests. So do we have any more nice things to give? Oh yes, the 6 principles. So this book has 6 chapters. And each of those is a principle. And it's the principle of organic order, the principle of partition, the principle of piecemeal growth, the principle of patterns, the principle of diagnosis, and the principle of coordination. And he gives those explicit meanings. The principle of piecemeal growth is you don't have a big design up front, which relates very strongly, I think, to Agile. You maybe have some big principles up front, but you don't have a big design up front, and you make incremental improvements. And oddly enough, the documentation workshop I've been going to encourages you to have a similar approach to documentation. So organic order in the growth of documentation, and you try and write documentation that's useful as it goes along, rather than imagining the end product and documenting it. And these things sound very abstract, but I think they have some meaning in practice, but I don't have enough practice. Diagnosis is roughly annual testing. You sort of have a review of what's going on and how is the system going. So diagnosis is also related to technical debt, such as we renovated this courtyard, but it's not working properly. So that sort of counts as technical debt. So, and I also see that related to the Nobel Prize in Economics a few years ago that went to Duflo and other people. And I only remember Duflo because the father's a mathematician whose name I've heard of. And they had an experimental approach to relief of poverty reduction programs, which has the community participation that is so important in Alexander's work in this book here. I'll stop for a moment, give you all a chance to chip in. Well, I think because it's nearly 7:10, and I'm at 7:30, you're allowed to leave or stay as you wish without causing any offense to anybody. So I sort of started, well, I gave you a quote from Plato from this book about dividing things into parts. And inspired by this, I've got 3 statements that I've made that have been influenced by Alexander. And you're welcome to criticize them or make your own statements or whatever. So software has an outer order. When I say order, I mean organic order and not totalitarian order, to use Alexander's phrases. So organic order is where the needs of all the parts are met and there's a harmony between the parts. Whereas totalitarian order is the master plan, the authoritarian government, the central planning committee, people being cogs in machines, that sort of thing. So software has an outer order that arises from human needs, both individual and social. So that's the outer order of software. And software has an inner order, which is not visible. And it's not tangible, and it's not audible. Its inner order arises forces that include cognitive burden, accuracy, and efficiency. And when I say cognitive burden, I mean the cognitive burden on the people who are writing and maintaining the software, and perhaps even proving it's correct, which is part of accuracy. So you've got at least 3 factors there, and depending upon the nature of the software and its stage in its evolution, cognitive burden might be the most important thing. and accuracy might be the most important thing, and efficiency might be the most important thing. So these things evolve over time. So I think that's probably enough for now. In the emergence of order, what is it? Synthesis of form. Alexander said something like the ultimate object of design is form, which means sort of shape. And its shape is a pattern arising as a consequence of forces. So this goes back to the dividing of the object to be discussed into pieces, which is there are many, many forces. And you want to simplify the matter so that you don't have to be aware of everything. And it's a bit like a mechanics problem where you introduce a frame of coordinates, a system of coordinates, and suddenly the problem becomes easier to solve. Or you have an invariant of motion, and then the problem becomes easier to solve. So it's the reduction of complexity whilst recognizing the complexity that actually does exist. I've gone a long way from Alexander, and Alexander was actually somebody who was involved in building, creating, designing, helping people design buildings that worked for them. So he was not a software engineer. But the soft part of computer science, which is, for example, today we had a problem, which is that there was a waiting room and I didn't know there was anybody in it. And when I say it's a waiting room, there wasn't a physical place, but it was called the waiting room. We know how it works. And suddenly you have breakout rooms and that sort of thing. So the social aspect of social software is in some sense architectural, or has architectural aspects, because people meet in rooms to go from one place to another, that sort of thing. And the what's the word? The virtual reality, the virtual world, Second Life, I think it's called. Those sorts of things very much play on the architectural thing, as does, I suppose, Minecraft. Time for me to stop. I've swallowed a lot. I've half digested it. And I've given it back out to you. I hope some of it is useful.
Let me ask a naive question. Is there any connection between Alexander and Klutz?
Alexander and Knuth? Not so far as I know. A search might find that out, but Alexander's quite a common name, so I don't know of any connection.
And of course, they were at universities across the bay from one another who have been longtime rivals, both in sports activities as well as in intellectual activities. One, his university being a state university and Don Knuth's being a private one.
Above all that.
Yeah. I mean, they've both been enormously influential institutions, and I've spent my adult life enjoying the fruits of their production and learning about them.
Oh, there's a nice thread on Reddit, which I haven't come across before, that does mention Knuth and similar. So I'll put that in the chat if I can. Oh, for technical problems, I can't read the... Okay. Another question, or should we go over to why I like tech?
Yeah.
All right, so Nelson has already given apologies that he might be called out. So Norman,
I was thinking about that, and I think it's because one of the 4 languages I know, being Lisp, Algol, PostScript, and TeX. So I think that they demarcate. They're exhaustive, but the 4 different languages. It represents. It's only the only one in its class, I think. PostScript at least has 4th beside it, and Algol, of course, has Algol is basically C++, Java, Python, and Fortran. But I think TeX is interesting because it's not one of the other ones.
so it's part of your computer language diversity. Very important part.
And it's the only one in its class.
It's the only one that's.
It's the only one in its class. There's only one language in the TeX.
Oh, is it?
In the TeX bundle.
It's in a class of 1.
Yeah. Whereas, C, C++, Java, Python are all basically indistinguishable.
I'll give one reason why I like TeX, which goes back about 30 years, which is a little bit more than 30 years, because I was able to buy a computer that allowed me to write mathematics without relying on technical typists. And that allowed me to write and publish some articles without being attached to a university. And the computer only cost $2,000.
Even now, that's quite expensive for a computer.
Well, you and I are not the only ones that like TeX, but maybe the only ones that are owning up. Nelson.
Yeah, I had to zip away because my phone rang and I've been expecting a call. For me, what was important about TeX was that it was obviously extremely powerful, produced very nice looking output, and importantly, was portable and free. And we've had experience in the past with commercial systems for document formatting that were tied to specific hardware, had annual license fees and limited access to certain people. And this just really never works out. Documents live a long time, and especially in the academic world and probably also in industry and government, documents get revised. And so you may think you're done with this document today, but a year later you come back and say, no, it's time, I need to do an update. And when it was tied to licensed software that suddenly wasn't available because the vendor went out of business or raised their prices beyond your budget, you were really stuck. So for me, a driving force in what I do is that I want things to be free and to be portable and to be well documented and usable by many people. TeX, I think, does an admirable job of supplying that. And none of the word processor market does it at all, because they have no concern for document stability, and they break things, and they can't even get the same ostensibly same version of software. I'm thinking particularly of Microsoft Office products that are available on, say, the Mac world and the Windows world. The same document won't format the same on those two systems, even though you believe you have the same version of, say, Microsoft Word, and that's an extremely frustrating situation. So my view is that I want to be able to produce documents and distribute them in a form that other people can use. And so PDF and HTML have worked quite well for that. I don't think anybody today has a particular issue with, as long as they can see the screen, of dealing with the PDF document. HTML is a little trickier because in HTML, the appearance of the document is not up to the producer of the document, but rather to the consumer. And the consumer can restrict the fonts that are used or specifies limits on their sizes, and the screen sizes could be anything from Jonathan's very large screen display to somebody's small mobile telephone. And so you really have to give up any hope of trying to have a particular view of a document when you target HTML. You have to think much more strongly in terms of structure, that you have sections and subsections and chapters and so on, and that's about all you can hope for. With mathematics, this of course poses a problem, because mathematics is visually complex, and it's also two-dimensional. So you can't just arbitrarily wrap mathematics and preserve meaning. And it is a considerable concern to people like me living in a mathematics department in a College of Science, that our work be presentable and understandable and not be mangled by some output system.
That's a long answer.
Yeah. Well, it's tech has been a major part of my life, because it solved a problem that I recognized even while I was a graduate student, that scientists were busy doing science, but they couldn't document their science. They could publish papers in journals, which meant they sent typescripts, that is written by a typewriter, off to a publisher who reset them, and that was completely out of their control. And the model at the time was you would get galleys back from the publisher, and then you'd go through those and correct all of the errors they introduced, and send those back. And after a few iterations, you finally arrived at a suitable format that you both agreed on, and that was what got published. But for something that moves quickly, like leading edge research or software development, it was just completely impossible to have documentation that matched what was going on. And tech really solved that problem.
So tech solved an important problem in scientific authoring and publishing.
Yes, and communication, because
communication.
Especially as electronic mail became prevalent, it's routine for people to share the source code of TeX and LaTeX documents via email, or simply to express a mathematical idea such as an equation by a little bit of TeX markup for that mathematics.
Yes.
And the word processor community just can't provide that. It just doesn't.
So it provided a language and system for mathematical content and for structured content.
Yeah. Now, I still think that most authors of TeX, that is practicing scientists and students and so on, don't really understand the critical significance of logical markup, as opposed to producing something that looks a certain way. And so the organization of files and user directories and the presentation of their ideas in paper form or in screen form.
We're talking about what I like about tech, not what we don't like about tech.
It's just that they haven't absorbed the idea that it's the structure that is really the overall guiding thing. You know, back when I was a school kid, we were ordered to write essays by our teacher in middle school. This would be age in the US and Canada, about ages 12 to 15. You were always told that you had to write an outline of your essay first and then write the essay. And none of us did that. We wrote the essay first and then wrote the outline of what we'd written, because we didn't really understand the importance of organization of your ideas at that age. But as you get older and have to do technical writing books or large reports and so on, the organization matters a great deal. And this is sort of independent of the document production system. But it's one that one often sees people writing, say, tech input that, for example, is about biology. Biology is full of two kinds of names, biological names and geographical names. They talk about a particular kind of lizard species found in southern Arizona. And those need special handling and often are mocked up, especially in text. But what most authors would do, whether they're using a word processor or TeX, would simply switch to an italic font or a small caps font or something like that. In other words, they would pick a font that gave the appearance they were expecting, without understanding that, what I really have here is a geographical name or a biological name or a chemical name that is worthy of having its own markup.
So what you like about tech is that it allows precision in communication.
Yes, and I can put in that markup. If I take a name like Phoenix, Arizona, and put it inside a macro argument, then it's clear that that macro not only flags this as being something unusual, namely requiring specific capitalization, but also has a particular meaning here, geography, that then might be used to have a pop-up map that would identify where Phoenix, Arizona is. And if all you do is say, I have a small caps name, Phoenix, Arizona, that tells you nothing other than that it's in a small caps font.
It's also true that I think you're right that not all not all authors manage to fully get with the program here. I remember talking to someone who worked for a publisher who remarked that, well, it is possible to get bold maths with a backslash section. It's not necessarily a good idea.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
You see, in the word processor world, the kinds of things that people do in authoring the document are really largely based on appearance. So they pull down a menu to
So what you like about
TeX,
is that it provides a useful discipline.
Right. And the word, what I'm arguing is that the word processor approach doesn't provide that discipline. People don't think about what is it that they're writing. They think about what does it look like. And I think that's quite harmful.
Well, certainly LaTeX goes beyond tech in that it concentrates on the logical structure. But when I write my own stuff, I use very, 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 very many macros. Basically anything which could change its appearance anywhere, I define my own macro and use it. So if I want to recycle text from a poster to an article, and then maybe for another journal or whatever, I don't have to change the input at all. I just have redefine the macro if I need it. And I can't really imagine working that way with anything other than LaTeX, really.
Yeah, because you've Philip understood the importance of marking things up for what they are, not for what they look like.
Yeah.
The appearance is the appearance might not even be an appearance. It might be an auditory signal. Someone is reading the contents of your macro argument.
Yeah, and some journals don't understand this. Some say, well, you're not allowed to use your own macros. I mean, if they actually understood LaTeX, there wouldn't be a problem. But then they say, well, it's not a big problem. You can just do a global search and replace. Now, if you just define something to be italic text, you could do that. But you've got macros which have maybe several optional arguments or things like that. And there's some logic behind it. It's not just a one-to-one correspondence.
Yes, I can appreciate their anxiety, however, because I think it's. I remember in the context of someone working for the Institute of Physics in the UK, but I think it's not specific to that. And the way they publish LaTeX is the same as the way they publish Word. They convert the LaTeX into XML, archive that, and then serialize the XML to LaTeX to print it. So I think that's where the personal macros would start to get complicated.
Yeah. Yeah, and in the contact I've had with publishers who do a lot of journal and book publication in the area of science and engineering and mathematics, they often farm the work out to service bureaus in lower wage areas, which has meant in the last 30 years, essentially Eastern Europe and India. And companies in those regions have developed a business model where they can take more or less standard LaTeX input and convert it quickly into the XML and PDF that the publisher wants. And if they come across a macro they've never seen before, it takes them extra time. And for them, time is money because they're paid essentially. It's like the manufacturer of clothing, on the number of pieces you produce, not on how difficult it was to produce that piece for you. publisher doesn't care. They just want the XML and the PDF back.
We've sort of got a conflict or a divergence of interest, and for very good reasons. Philip likes the fact that in TeX you can define macros, and for a very good reason, the publishers don't like that in TeX you can define macros. And in Milton Keynes, where I live, they have roads for the cars and what are called redways for cyclists and pedestrians. And by and large, that works quite well, except now we've got these electric scooters that go at tremendous speeds and frighten old age pensioners like myself. And so from a larger point of view, and if you like, from a holistic point of view, to go to something that's more Christopher Alexander, the problem isn't that one person likes TeX macros and the other person loathes them. The problem is that they're sharing the same space. The conflict arises not because they have different interests, but because they're sharing the same space. In the 1950s, there were these modern housing estates went up, and along with these housing estates was this terrible phrase, no ball games. Mm-hmm. Right, you weren't allowed to play ball games because it upset the people that lived there, but the children didn't have anywhere to play ball games, and that was really the problem. And the council solving this problem by saying no ball games is a little bit totalitarian, and we're not talking about organic order in terms of Christopher Alexander, where the needs of all parts are met. I think that was exactly what you said, that the needs of all parties are met. And so the allowing of macros is great for Philip, and it's a pain for the publishers, and the system brings these people into conflict. And part of the design of a publishing system would be to recognize that conflict and at least reduce it or manage it, if not
it's also the case that you might want to have different, you can have different goals in different contexts. So that an article that you're submitting to a journal, you are aware that that thing is going to be given to someone else to process. And because it's LaTeX, you are confident that that will be not a particularly lossy process. And so, but that's different from the case where you are, where your goal is to produce a PDF for yourself to print out or to give to other people. And so those are two different sets of constraints. In the one case, you can go wild with whatever macros you want because you're the only consumer, and your goal is clear. It's something which is you're not handing this thing off to anyone else. In another case, the goal is equally clear, but it's a case in the sense that you're giving the LaTeX to someone else, and you have to consider their needs, if you like. I don't think it's as simple as totalitarian or not. It's just a case of how do you interface with other people, or do you need to interface with other people? And if you don't, then there's all sorts of fun and games you can play. Wonderful procrastinations you can do. One of the reasons I like TeX is the huge amounts of scope for procrastination it it's given me over the years. But if I'm doing something for a journal, I can't do that. I can't give free rein to my creativity because, and I think one could overinterpret it. It's just a matter of audience and affordances, if you like, rather than necessarily anything profound.
Right and wrong depends on context. Mm-hmm. Going back to Alexander in this book here in 1964, he's saying he's actually arguing against the idea that good design comes out of the designer's head. He uses examples, things like vacuum cleaners and kettles. And he says, it's all a matter of context. The context provides the forces. The boat, the sailing boat, moves in the water because of the forces upon it. The force of the wind on the sails and the force of the water on the keel. I don't know if you know about sailing, but a sailing boat will not sail without the keel going down. And when you step on the soap in the shower, you have this lump of soap and your foot goes down on it and there's the hard floor underneath and it shoots out. And that's exactly how a sailing boat can actually go into the wind and by tacking, sail upwind. And it's all to do with the forces being supplied by the context. And one of the reasons why totalitarian design doesn't work is because there is not awareness of the forces. The awareness of the forces is suppressed, ignored, unheard. A lot of the complaint of the powerless was, well, we went to a meeting, but we weren't heard. And that means that whoever's responsible, the design, isn't aware of the forces. So a lot of the Oregon book is about getting people aware of forces, getting the right people making the decisions, and those people being aware of the forces involved. So representations being made.